Something Evans didn't or refused to see if he cut where he intended it would. Tear through a critical vessel. She hesitated just a moment, then she spoke. "Doctor," she said, her voice clear and steady based on the patient's anatomy and current vitals. "I recommend approaching from a different angle. The lateral spread exposes the artery more than anticipated." The room froze. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. Dr. David turned slowly as, narrowing above his mask, every eye and ear turned to her. From the gallery above, the board members leaned forward. Maria could feel the weight of her words crashing down, but she stood her ground. David didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched, his fingers curled tighter around the instrument. The pause stretched, then almost imperceptibly he adjusted. "Noted," he muttered, and cut where she recommended. The tension began to lift. Within minutes the procedure moved forward. The incision revealed exactly what she had anticipated: dangerously close proximity to the artery. Her correction had likely saved the patient's life, and everyone knew it. The room finished in silence. Efficient focus successful, but not war. Maria helped with the post-op transition, checked the bandages, cleaned the tools, and all the while not a single word was said to her. Not by Evans, not by the assistants, not by the observers. It was like she didn't exist, like saving a life meant nothing when it came from the wrong lips. She was untying her gown when Evans stepped beside her. "Nurse West," he said coldly. "With me." She followed him without question down the hallway, past patient recovery, into a quiet corridor behind the physician's suite. He opened a side door that led to a small and used consult room and stepped in. Maria followed the door, closing softly behind her, and then he turned. "What the hell do you think you were doing in there?" His voice was no longer clinical, it was venom. Maria stood her ground. I was doing my job, protecting the patient." "You embarrass me," he hissed, "in front of my staff, in front of board members. I offered a clinical observation based on the patient's vitals. You followed it." His face flushed red. "You think that makes you special? You think one good call erases your attitude, your presence?" Maria's jaw tightened. "My presence? You'll never belong here," he spat. "You walk around with your head held high like you've earned something. Let me make one thing clear: people like you weren't hired because of merit. You were hired to check a box in one way or another. That box gets erased." Maria's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but her voice stayed. "Even you can belittle me, you can assign me the worst shifts, but I will always protect my patients, even from surgeons like you." He stepped forward, close enough for her to smell the bitterness on his breath. "Enjoy your moment, Nurse West," he sneered, "because it's your last." And then from just outside the door a voice spoke. "Actually, Dr. David, it's yours." Both of them turned. The door opened slowly, and there stood Morgan Powell. No wheelchair, no cane, just a phone in her hand and fury in her eyes. David blinked. "Miss Morgan, you shouldn't be." Morgan held up the phone. "I heard every word, and so will the board." He pulled. Maria looked from Morgan to Evans, realization dawning across her face like sunlight through broken glass. "Morgan stepped into the room. I was there I was watching from the gallery. I saw her save that patient's life, and I've been watching a lot longer than you think." David took a step back. "I don't understand," he stammered. "You don't need to," she replied. "You just need to collect your things." Maria's breath caught. Morgan turned to her with something soft beneath the steel. "You okay?" Maria swallowed hard. "I am now." Morgan nodded. "Once let's go." She didn't have to say it again. Dr. Troy. David stood frozen as the two women walked out of the room, one who had waited in silence and one who had finally undeniably been heard. Justice sometimes comes softly, other times it walks down a hallway with its chin raised high and a phone full of receipts. This was the breaking point, and everything that came after would never be the same. The morning air outside Jude's hospital had a strange feel to it. Heavier, almost charged, like a storm had passed but left its echo behind. There was no rain, no lightning, no dark skies, and yet every staff member who walked through the front entrance that day felt the static under their skin. Maria West noticed it the moment she stepped off the staff elevator. There was a tension in the hallway, subtle but infectious. Conversations that usually trickled with laughter or casual complaints were now quiet murmurs, heads leaning closer than usual, eyes scanning doorway. She passed two junior nurses whispering beside the nurse's station. "Did you get the email?" "Yeah, executive call, all staff mandatory." Maria's brows furrowed. She hadn't seen the message yet. She pulled out her phone and tapped open her inbox. There it was. Urgent hospital-wide emergency conference meeting, 11 a.m. main auditorium. Attendance required. No subject line, no explanation, just a time allocation and the unmistakable scent of something coming to a head. By 10:45 the entire hospital seemed to be migrating toward one place. Nurses and scrubs, doctors in white coats, admin staff with their clipboards and schedules, all funneling into the main auditorium with uneasy curiosity. Maria found a seat near the middle, flanked by faces she recognized, but rarely spoke to. A few nodded at her. Others avoided her gaze. The room buzzed, everyone waiting for someone to explain the tension. No one dared name. Then the doors opened and the room gasped. It was her, Morgan Powell, but not as they had seen her before. Gone was the patient gown, the bandages, the quiet disguise. In her place stood a woman in a sleek black suit tailored to perfection. Her heels clicked across the auditorium floor with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. She carried no briefcase, no security team, just a slim Phone in one hand and a thin silver pin on her lapel, an emblem Maria didn't recognize, but others clearly did. Gasps turned into whispers. That's Morgan Powell, the board chair. No, not the chair. She owns the entire hospital. Maria's chest tightened across the room. Dr. David had just entered. He stopped mid-stride, his eyes locking on Morgan with a flash of confusion, then horror. She saw him, didn't flinch. Instead, Morgan walked to the front, climbed the steps to the podium, and turned to face the room. The whispers died. What remained was silence and the unmistakable pulse of anticipation. She set her phone down gently on the podium, looked across the auditorium, and smiled, not warmly, not crewy, just enough to say, "Let's begin." "Good morning," she said, her voice smooth and unshaken. "Some of you know me, many of you don't. My name is Morgan Powell. I am the CEO and sole owner of Jude's Hospital." You could have heard a pin drop. A few heads turned instinctively toward Dr. David. His face had gone pale, his mouth twitched as if reaching for a rebuttal that wouldn't come. Maria sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. Morgan continued, "Until last week I had never walked the halls of this hospital as anything other than its benefactor. I signed off on policy-approved budgets, shook hands at charity galas, but I'd never been admitted. I'd never worn a hospital bracelet or eaten from a plastic tray. I'd never been anonymous." She let that sink in. "That changed 10 days ago when I was admitted for a minor knee procedure under pseudonym. I chose to remain unnamed, unremarkable, so I could observe my own institution without filters." Morgan looked out over the sea of faces, her voice growing colder. "What I observed was disturbing." A low murmur threatened to rise again, but her hand lifted slightly and the room stilled once more. "I came expecting medical care. I received it, but what I also witnessed was a culture of exclusion, intimidation, and silent cruelty, and not just toward me, but toward your own." Morgan picked up her phone, "And I didn't just observe it, I recorded it." There was a ripple through the crowd. She tapped the screen once, and a recording began to play through the auditorium speakers. "At a wicked doctor shames a black nurse in front of a patient, unaware of the true identity of the patient." The day felt calm yet strange, painted in soft Michigan gray with a whisper of cold brushing across the hospital courtyard. It was the kind of morning that made people wrap their coats tighter and quicken their pace, but not Maria Young. Nurse Maria stood still for a moment just outside the front entrance of Jude's Hospital. Her breath puffed gently into the air, a visible sign of the nerves and excitement tangled in her chest. In her hand she held a worn leather bag, clean but modest. Her scrubs were freshly pressed, her sneakers spotless, and her ID badge clipped neatly to her front pocket. Today was her first official day as a registered nurse at one of Michigan's most prestigious medical institutions. A dream realized, a goal fought for, a battle already half won. That was before the doors opened as Maria approached the front desk. The receptionist, a pale woman with tight lips and perfectly pinned blonde hair, barely looked up. "Yes?" the woman asked, I still scanning something on her screen. Maria cleared her throat, softly smiling with genuine warmth. "Good morning, I'm Maria West. I'm the new nurse on the morning rotation now." The receptionist looked up, but not with welcome. Her gaze drifted up and down Maria's frame in a swift, measured flicker that said everything without a word. "You're early," she replied curtly. "Locker rooms are down the corridor. Nurse's station is on the second floor. Someone will orient you eventually. No. Welcome aboard." No handshake, no smile. Maria offered a polite thank you and turned down the hallway, trying not to let the chill in the receptionist's voice seep into her bones. She told herself it was just a rough start. Maybe the woman was having a bad morning. Maybe first days were always like this. As she walked passing gleaming rooms and echoing hallways, she caught glimpses of others, orderlies, lab techs, nurses. Their conversations dipped into silence. When she came near, some glanced at her, then looked quickly away. A few offered hollow smiles. No one said a word. By the time Maria reached the nurse's station, her optimism was shrinking beneath the weight of invisible walls. She tried again, this time approaching a pair of women in scrubs who were reviewing charts. "Hi, I'm a no," one of them said quickly without looking up. The other one nudged her and gave Maria a strained, polite smile. "Sorry, first day chaos. Head nurse is doing rounds, but she'll probably circle back soon." Maria nodded slowly, unsure if that was an offer of help or a subtle dismissal. She stood quietly beside the station, hands folded in front of her, listening to the quiet hum of a world that seemed to have no place for her in it. 15 minutes passed. No one spoke to her. Then she heard the click of hard leather saws behind her. She turned to see a man in a pristine white coat approaching with the slow, deliberate gait of someone used to being listened to. His hair was peppered with gray, perfectly combed. A silver name badge caught the light on his lapel. Dr. Troy David. It read. His eyes found hers, cool, assessing, and unreadable. "You must be Maria," he said, extending a hand that seemed more performative than welcoming. Maria reached out and shook it, her grip confident though his was limp. "Yes, Dr. David, it's a pleasure to meet you," he nodded, glancing around briefly. "First days can be overwhelming. I assume you've familiarized yourself with hospital protocols. I've read all orientation materials and shadowed in emergency triage during my residency. I'm ready." Dr. Evans's lips curled, not quite a smile, more like a smirk tugging at the edge of professionalism. "Good, we run a tight ship here. Excellence is the baseline at Street Jude's, you'll be expected to meet it without excuses. Maria's smile faltered. Only slightly. I wouldn't expect anything less. Without another word, Dr. David turned and walked away, his coat trailing sharply behind him. She watched him disappear around the corner, her outstretched professionalism left hanging in the space between them. It wasn't the greeting she'd hoped for, but Maria had learned long ago that expectations and reality rarely matched. Still, it stung. She blinked hard, pushing the disappointment down. She reminded herself why she was here, why she chose nursing. Her mother had spent years working late nights as a caregiver, teaching her that compassion was not weakness but power, especially when no one else offered it. Maria straightened her spine and stepped behind the nurse's station, waiting to be given her first assignment. Meanwhile, just 2 floors up, a different kind of story was beginning. A private recovery suite stood quiet and still, its windows open to the gray sky outside. Inside the room, a woman reclined against a stack of pillows, one knee elevated beneath soft white gauze. Her hair, silver with a hint of blonde, was pulled back into a practical braid. She looked ordinary, perhaps too ordinary, but Morgan Powell had built an empire by never looking like the most powerful person in the room. As the billionaire owner of several top medical institutions, including St. Jude's, Morgan had arrived for surgery under a different name, occupying one of the hospital's private wings without fanfare or recognition. Her team had arranged it quietly. No executive badges, no corporate memos, just another patient recovering from orthopedic surgery, and she wanted it that way. Morgan had long suspected that the public face of St. Jude's, its diversity brochures, public outreach, glowing reputation, hid something deeper, something far less polished. She had received anonymous reports, whispers from former employees, hints of racial bias and bullying, but paper trails could be scrubbed. Staff silence, complaints buried. So she came herself, not a CEO, but as a ghost in the system. She watched, she listened, and what she saw unsettled her more than she had expected. From her hospital bed, she'd seen Maria walk by in the hallway. She'd heard the shift in tone, the coded language used by the nurses. She'd heard Dr. David speaking loudly at the elevator bay, complaining about diversity hires when he thought no one important was listening. But Morgan was listening. She didn't need a camera crew or public expose. She had something better, her own ears and a voice recorder on her bedside table. For now, she said nothing. She pressed record and let the story unfold from the 4th floor of St. Jude's Hospital. The world looked oddly serene. Snow clung to the Michigan skyline in a gray-white silence, blanketing parking lots and rooftops with the illusion of purity. Inside room 412, the hush of machines and the occasional chirp of the vitals monitor created a soundtrack of recovery. Morgan Powell lay propped against a stack of pillows, her right leg elevated in a sling, her left hand gently resting over a plush white blanket. It was only her second full day post-op, and though the physical pain from her knee surgery had lessened, another ache had begun to gnaw at her, something deeper, not in her body, in her conscience. She had not come here as Morgan Powell, billionaire CEO and the owner of the hospital. She had come as Eleanor Morgan, an anonymous patient admitted for a standard orthopedic procedure. No one here knew her real name, and that was exactly how she intended it. But anonymity came with a price. People showed their true selves when they thought you were no one important. Morgan's first clue had arrived quietly, like most truths do. A nurse had entered her room on her first night. Not Maria, a different nurse, younger, rushed, distracted vitals. The nurse had muttered without eye contact, fumbling for the BP cuff. Morgan had smiled. Rough day. The nurse hadn't even looked up. Just long, she said flatly, then muttered under her breath, thanks to the diversity hire. Morgan's brow twitched. I'm sorry. The nurse looked up too quickly, eyes wide, clearly not realizing she had been heard. Nothing, she said, forcing a smile. Blood pressure's fine, I'll be back later. Morgan said nothing more, but that night she stared at the ceiling long after the lights dimmed, her mind uneasy. She didn't need to ask who the diversity hire was. The next morning she found out for certain. Nurse Maria entered her room with a soft knock and a gentle, competent smile. Good morning, Miss Morgan. I'm Nurse Maria. I'll be looking after you during the day shift. Please, Morgan replied with a nod. Just Morgan. All right, Morgan, Maria said, her tone calm and comforting. She moved with practiced ease, adjusting the bed, checking the floor, fluffing the pillow behind Morgan's back with a quiet efficiency that felt more like care than routine. Unlike the others, Maria looked directly at her, not past her, not over her, not through her. For a moment, Morgan simply observed. There was something about Maria, something composed yet weary, like someone walking into wind, but refusing to bend. Her eyes were kind, but there was a heaviness behind them, and Morgan, an expert in reading boardroom eyes, saw what so few noticed. Maria was working through pain, the silent kind, the kind that came not from the body but from being constantly measured and found wanting. Later that day, Morgan got her second confirmation. She was standing while leaning against the bathroom sink in her room, gripping the cold porcelain as she tried to stretch her leg. The door to her room was cracked open and voices floated in from the hallway. Have you seen how she walks around like she owns the place? Came a voice, a nurse, female, familiar. She hasn't even been here a week, another replied, but Dr. David isn't going to put up with that attitude much longer. Morgan paused, barely breathing. Let her keep smiling, she'll slip up the first one, said they. Always do a small silence followed then laughter, not loud, not joyful, just the kind that makes your skin crawl. Morgan stepped back to the bed, her mind swirling. They always do. By the time Maria returned to check her drip, Morgan had made up her mind that night as snow thickened against the hospital windows and most of the staff had gone home. Morgan unlocked her iPhone and opened the voice memo app. She hit record. Her voice was calm but clipped. Day 3 at St. Jude's. I'm currently recovering from right knee arthroscopy in room 412 under the alias Eleanor Morgan. I have overheard on 3 separate occasions verbal indications of workplace discrimination, primarily targeting one employee, nurse Maria West. Today I will begin documenting what I hear. She stopped the recording, labeled it and saved it under a folder titled St. Jude's Observations. The following morning Morgan was already awake when Maria arrived. The soft knock at the door was immediately familiar. Morning, Maria greeted with that same gentle cadence. How's the pain today? Manageable, Morgan replied, mostly just bored. Maria smiled. Well, we'll fix that with a little walk later if you're up for it. As Maria checked the dressing on her leg, Morgan resisted the urge to speak her truth. You're being what she wanted to say. You're being recorded. I'm going to change everything, but she didn't. Not yet, not until she was certain. The days that followed revealed more than Morgan could have imagined. In the hallway, she overheard Dr. Troy David discussing Maria's assignment schedule with another physician. They didn't notice Morgan standing behind the partially drawn curtain of the rehab room. I'm not giving her high-profile patients, Dr. David said flatly. Let her cut her teeth on the hard ones first. If she can't handle it, HR can reassign her. The other physician hesitated. You sure that's the best use of her skills? Evan scoffed. She's lucky to be here. We all know why she was hired. Morgan pressed record. Day 5 voice memo number 7. Troy David stated, Nurse Maria was only hired to fulfill a diversity quota. Intends to assign her only the most difficult and least visible patients. Tone dismissive and patronizing. The recordings piled up. So did the moments of silent cruelty. Maria offered to help another nurse with a heavy lift and was ignored. She brought a cup of water to a crying patient and was reprimanded for wasting time. She corrected a medication label error and was told she should double-check herself first. Yet through it all, Maria never once showed bitterness. Not when a patient refused her care, not when she was left off the staff rotation email, not even when Dr. David scolded her in the corridor loud enough for passing orderlies to hear. Morgan caught that moment too. You're not here to make waves, Dr. David said in a low voice, standing too close to Maria's face. You're here to work, so stop trying to impress everyone. You're not special. Nurse West. Maria blinked but said nothing. Her silence wasn't submission, it was endurance. Morgan recorded the entire exchange from her wheelchair just around the corner. That night she replayed the clip 3 times, not because she needed proof but because she needed resolve. She added another memo. Voice note number 13. Dr. David publicly berates Nurse Maria. Verbal tone aggressive statement implies that Maria's efforts to perform well are viewed as threatening rather than competent. Pattern emerging. Morgan set the phone down and stared into the dark. This wasn't just a culture problem, it was a character problem from the top down, and she owned it. Literally every wall, every payroll, every contract. Morgan's silence was no longer passive observation, it was a sharpened blade, and she was waiting for the perfect moment to wield it. Still Maria remained unaware. She continued to check Morgan's dressings, adjust her bed settings, bring her an extra blanket when she shivered. Thanks for being so kind, Morgan said quietly one morning as Maria helped her stand. Maria tilted her head slightly, surprised by the softness in her voice. Of course, why wouldn't I be? Morgan met her eyes. I just imagine it must be hard to stay kind when no one else seems to notice. Maria paused for a beat, then smiled, not with joy but with quiet understanding. They notice, she said. They just don't say it out loud. Morgan nodded slowly and then she pressed record again. It began like a trickle, almost unnoticeable. A missed rotation here, a late update to the duty roster there. A back-to-back shift slipped into the schedule without warning, but by the end of the week the pattern had grown undeniable. Maria was being overloaded, and not with routine work. Her assignments read like a checklist of staff avoidance. Mr. Langston in room 306, who had thrown a bedpan at a nurse just last week. Mrs. Grady in ICU, known for screaming abuse at anyone she disliked. And Mr. Hale in 319, a man so openly bigoted that most of the nursing team refused to treat him unless forced. Maria got them all. She didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. Each morning she slipped into her blue scrubs, laced her sneakers, and walked through the glass doors of St. Jude's with her head held high even as her stomach tightened with dread. There was no welcome waiting for her on the other side, no warmth from the nurse's station, just loaded glances and the unspoken message in the air: you don't belong here and you will break. Dr. Troy David made sure of that. He never yelled, that would have been too easy to report. Instead he wielded words like surgical instruments, sharp, subtle, designed to cut without bleeding. Interesting choice of dosage, Nurse West, he'd say in front of residents' eyebrows raised in mock curiosity. Of course we all learn at our own pace, or I'd double-check your vitals next time unless you'd like to spend more time reviewing the protocol manual. He never corrected her in private, always in front of others. That way the shame lingered. Longer one afternoon after finishing a 12-hour shift with no break, Maria walked into the staff lounge just in time to hear two nurses murmuring behind the vending machine. "She's overdoing it." One whispered, "Trying too hard, it's embarrassing, I know." The other replied, "Dr. David is just waiting for her to mess up." Honestly, same. They didn't know she had walked in, and when they did, they turned away, not with guilt but with that practiced hospital indifference that cut deeper than any insult. Maria didn't speak. She simply turned, walked back out, and found an empty linen closet where she sat on a step stool, trembling with exhaustion, her fingers shaking, pulled out her phone. She didn't want to cry, not here, not again, but she hit the call button anyway, and after 2 rings the warmest voice in the world answered. "Baby girl," her mother said without even needing a hello. "What's wrong?" Maria's throat clenched. "Mama, is it happening again?" "Yes," Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "Worse this time. They are waiting for me to fall. They want it. They are watching for it." There was silence on the line, the kind that held power. Then her mother spoke. "Listen to me, Maria West. You don't let tired people with weak hearts and fearful minds tell you who you are. You hear me?" Maria wiped her cheek, nodding into the darkness. "You are my daughter. You are a nurse. You are strong, and you come from a line of women who survived worse than whispers and petty sabotage. Now you hold your head up, do your work better than anyone else, and don't you ever let them see you break." Maria closed her eyes. "Yes, Mama." That night she went home, laid in bed with her eyes wide open, and made herself a promise they may try to bury her, but they didn't realize she was a seed. The next morning she was assigned to room 214. Mr. Hale. The chart included a note that most staff already knew: refuses care from specific personnel, has verbally abused past nurses. Maria paused at the door, took a breath, and walked in. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and resentment. Mr. Hale, a white man in his late 70s, glared at her as if she brought the illness in with her. "What are you doing here?" he spat. Maria smiled gently. "I'm your nurse today, Mr. Hale. I'll just be checking your vitals. I asked for someone else, not one of your kind." Maria had heard it all before, in whispers, in silence, in policy disguised as preference, but this was different. Naked hatred with no mask. "I understand your discomfort," she said softly, "but your care is my priority, and I take that seriously. I won't have you touching me," he growled, slamming his hand against the tray table. "I'll keep contact to a minimum, sir, but I must ensure your medication is administered correctly." He muttered something beneath his breath, something old and ugly. Maria continued, calm, steady. She took his blood pressure, noted it in the chart, and placed his medications on the tray with the same care she gave every patient. Only once did her hand tremble, and even then it didn't show. Outside the room, Morgan Powell sat in her wheelchair, watching. She hadn't meant to linger, but she'd heard the tone from down the hallway and rolled closer, drawn by instinct. She heard it all: the slurs, the venom, and the way Maria handled it. Not with fire, but with grace, sharpened by restraint. That night Morgan hit record again. Day 12. Nurse Maria was verbally assaulted by a patient who refused her care. She remained calm, dignified, and professional. No staff intervened, no supervisor present. Dr. David passed by during the exchange and did not stop. The next morning the whispers changed. "She's cracking," one nurse said in the break room. "Just wait," someone else replied. "She'll make a mistake. They all do eventually." Maria heard that too. It no longer hurt, it hardened her. She wasn't breaking, she was evolving. By the end of the week she had completed 4 back-to-back shifts, 3 of them overnight. She hadn't had a full lunch in days. Her feet HDHD, her eyes burned, and still she walked the halls with purpose. Even Morgan, watching from behind her anonymous veil, was beginning to feel her own restraint fraying. The list of recordings grew, the notes became longer, the anger became personal. Every time Maria was passed over for praise, Morgan made a note. Every time a nurse erased her name from the whiteboard and replaced it with their own, Morgan recorded the exchange. She had enough now, more than enough, but she wanted one thing more: the truth to be undeniable. Maria never stopped showing up. One night a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder cracked through the dark like a warning shot. Patients were on edge. A power flicker caused panic in ICU, and through it all Maria remained. She comforted an elderly man who hadn't slept in days. She calmed a panicked child whose mother had just been rushed into surgery. She held the hand of a woman dying alone, and she did it while barely standing. That night Maria walked to the supply closet and sat down just for a moment, just to breathe. Morgan rolled up quietly in her chair, stopped just outside the door. She didn't go in, she simply watched. Maria sat with her head against the wall, eyes closed, lips moving, praying, repeating her mother's words, reminding herself who she was. Morgan didn't know, but in that moment the strength she had been watching from afar crystallized into something undeniable. Maria West wasn't surviving, she was rising, and the world around her was too blind to notice it, but Morgan saw it, and she was about to make sure everyone else did too. The buzz started with a whisper. By 11:30 a.m. it had swept across Jude's like an electric current. Something big was coming, something important. The elevators ran non-stop. Phones rang more than usual. Doctors who normally kept to themselves were suddenly checking in at nurse stations. The rumor was simple but potent: a high-risk emergency operation was scheduled for the afternoon, and not just any surgery. This one was being closely Observed by the hospital's board members and representatives from a prestigious medical journal. Everyone knew what that meant. One operation, one chance. All eyes watching. Maria had heard the whispers by noon. She stood at the nurse's station checking over patient files when a fellow nurse leaned over and muttered under her breath, "David is heading this one." Maria's stomach tensed. Dr. Troy Evans. Of course, the man St. Jude's paraded when the cameras showed up, the one whose credentials gleamed like polished brass. And the same man who had made her life a daily battle. He would be leading the surgical team, and that meant it would be. Political precision wasn't just expected, it was demanded. Then came the real shock. Maria, head nurse Cullen, called out from her clipboard, "You're being pulled into all 3 emergency procedure prep now." She blinked me. Several heads turned, a few eyebrows raised. No one said it aloud. But the question hung thick in the air. Why? And just down the hall outside the physician's lounge, Dr. Evans was already speaking to a junior physician with a smug curl to his lip. "Let's see how she handles pressure," he said, too low for most to hear, but not low enough to go unnoticed. Morgan Powell, walking slowly with a cane, now had just rounded the corner. She paused, standing just beyond the archway, unnoticed. She didn't say a word, she didn't move, but she quietly tapped the screen on her phone and hit record. Maria scrubbed in with meticulous care. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this wasn't just a procedure, it was a test, a public one. She entered the all like someone walking into a courtroom. The lights were bright, the faces masked, the air thick with sterile anticipation. Dr. David stood at the head of the table, already in command. Around him were the best texts, assistants and observers. Behind the gallery glass above Maria was the outlier as the monitors beeped and the drapes were drawn. She fell into rhythm, her training kicked in. She passed instruments smoothly, watched the vitals, tracked blood pressure and oxygen levels with precision. For the first 20 minutes she was invisible, which for a nurse in a room like this meant perfection, but perfection can only stretch so far when ego outweighs caution. It began subtly. Dr. David hand a trimmer, barely noticeable. Maria saw it when he adjusted his grip on the scalpel. She thought it might be her imagination until she saw it again. Stronger this time. As he reached for the next instrument, he was sweating through his gloves, through his control, and then came the moment. Evans announced the incision he was about to make, the one that would sever tissue dangerously close to an artery. Maria's breath caught from where she stood with the patient's anatomy displayed fully before her. She saw first it was background noise, a hallway, faint voices. Then the clarity hit like a slap. Dr. David voice, "What the hell do you think you were doing in there, you embarrassed me in front of my staff, in front of board members?" Maria felt her breath stop. On the recording her own voice replied, sturdy but shaken, "I was doing my job, protecting the patient." Then Evans again, louder, cruer, "You'll never belong here. You were hired to check a box. In one way or another, that box gets erased." The room recoiled. Even those who had never said a word against Maria suddenly seemed unable to meet her eyes. Morgan let the words hang in the air. She didn't stop the audio immediately. She let it finish. She let the silence take root. Then she spoke again, voice sharp now. Dr. David was unaware I was standing outside the door recording every word, just as he was unaware when I recorded him dismissing nurses, mocking staff, refusing patients for superficial reasons. I have documented 5 hours of audio evidence collected over the span of 9 days, all within this building. She locked eyes with Dr. David. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. Morgan turned back to the crowd. "I didn't come here to shame you. I came here to hold a mirror up to this hospital and its people. What I saw in Nurse Maria West was more than professionalism, more than skill. I saw courage, dignity, restraint." She paused. The silence leaned forward, and what I saw in many others was cowardice, compliance, and silence in the face of injustice. Morgan stepped out from behind the podium, letting her voice carry without a microphone. "Now there will be consequences." The room barely breathed, but there will also be change. Maria's vision blurred with shock. She could feel every beat of her heart pounding against her ribs. Across the aisle, a few people looked her way, not with pity this time, but with something else, recognition, maybe even remorse. Morgan returned to the podium and rested her hand on the phone. "Dr. David," she said, addressing him without flinch, "you are hereby suspended pending a full investigation by the Hospital Ethics Board. Your privileges are revoked effective immediately." Gasps. Again, real ones. David took a step back. "You can't." "I can," Morgan said coolly, "and I have." He stared at her for a moment longer, as if looking for a lifeline. None came. Security stepped quietly into the rear of the auditorium. The auditorium remained silent. Maria closed her eyes for a brief second, just to center herself, then opened them to the sight of Dr. Troy Evans walking down the aisle, flanked by silence. No applause, no outrage, just a clean removal, the end of a reign built on intimidation. Morgan looked out at the audience again. "I expect every staff member to read the new guidelines that will be emailed before day's end. Mandatory inclusion and ethics training will begin next week, and make no mistake, what has been tolerated until now will be tolerated no longer." Then finally her voice softened. "I believe in what this hospital can be, but belief is not enough. Change begins with truth, and now the truth has been heard." With that, she stepped down from the podium and exited the room, her heels clicking once more. Like a gavel dropped on marble, the room sat in stunned stillness, and somewhere in that silence something shifted. A wall Didn't just shake, it cracked, and for the first time in a long time the light started to pour in morning sunlight. Streamed through the tall arched windows of St. Jude's, casting long golden beams. Across the polished floors the hospital looked the same, white walls, blue uniforms, the soft beep of monitors echoing in quiet corridors, but something had changed. Maria West could feel it. With every step she took she walked through those familiar halls, not as the nurse too many had dismissed, not as the girl trying to earn respect in shadows, but as Chief Nurse Maria West, appointed, recognized, respected. Her ID badge now gleamed beneath the words Head of Nursing Operations, and the same doors that once opened reluctantly now welcomed her with soft nods and lifted chins. Colleagues who had once avoided her gaze now offered it freely. A quiet "Good morning, Chief" followed her through the corridors. The stares had shifted from suspicion to admiration. Even those who had stood silently while she endured whispers and slights now extended greetings with softened expressions. Maria didn't forget. She hadn't come for praise, she hadn't stayed for recognition, she had stayed because someone had to, and now she was the someone at the top. In her new office, high above the surgical wing, Maria opened the large window, letting the spring breeze roll in. It was still early, just past 7 o'clock a.m. The hospital hadn't yet reached its daytime hum. She crossed to her desk, a sleek modern surface of walnut and brushed metal, and placed a small weathered photo frame at the center. It was her mother, smiling, holding baby Maria in her arms, wearing a nurse's cap from a generation that had fought for even fewer seats at the table. Maria exhaled. "You're here with me," she whispered, brushing a finger across the glass. "We made it." Her hand reached for the drawer beside her. Inside were the old notes she used to keep, reminders to stay calm, to document everything, to breathe. She read through them one last time, then tucked them away into a sealed envelope marked "Before." From now on she wasn't fighting to survive the system, she was leading it. The knock on her door was gentle. "Come in," she called. The door opened and in walked a woman who needed no introduction, Morgan Powell. She didn't dress like a billionaire. Today it was a soft grey blouse and cream slacks, no dramatic heels, no designer coat, just calm confidence and a faint knowing smile. "Maria stood your early." Morgan smiled. "Old habit. I like to see the world before it spins too fast." Maria gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Coffee only if you're pouring it." They both laughed, a sound that still felt new between them, but natural as Maria filled 2 cups from the new coffee station she'd installed. She glanced at Morgan, who was looking out the window at the city skyline beyond. "I thought you'd disappear after the conference," Maria said. "I thought I would too," Morgan replied, "but it turns out watching people change, it's addictive." Maria handed her the cup and settled into her chair. "St. Jude is still adjusting." Morgan nodded. "Change doesn't settle overnight, but it started. That's the hard part." They sipped in companionable silence for a few moments. The hum of early staff movement floated faintly through the door carts, rolling pages being called, the heartbeat of the hospital ticking along. "We're starting the first diversity review today," Maria said. "Not just policies, practice. Who gets hurt, who gets promoted, who gets passed over." Morgan raised her cup too. "Overdue justice." Maria touched hers gently to Morgan's, to never going silent again. The new program, spearheaded jointly by Maria and Morgan, had already begun branching out across the healthcare United system. St. Jude's would serve as the model. Training manuals were being rewritten, whistleblower protections were doubled, real-time support liaison were introduced in every department, and for the first time in the hospital's 70-year history, every new hire would be required to take part in immersive bias training before they ever touched a patient chart. It wasn't just paperwork anymore, it was people listening, relearning, shifting. Maria leaned back, taking it in. She had fought so long for a sliver of space now. She was the one setting the table. Weeks passed, and with every new policy enforced, every hallway smile that wasn't strained, every nurse who felt safe enough to speak freely, the cracks in the old foundation widened and light flooded. In the tipping point came 3 months later. Maria received an invitation in the mail. Heavy stock paper, gold embossed lettering, National Healthcare Equity and Inclusion Conference keynote speaker, Chief Nurse Maria West, St. Jude's Hospital. She stared at it for several seconds before allowing herself to smile. The night before the conference, she barely slept. The nerves weren't fear anymore, they were the weight of what it meant to speak, to carry every invisible nurse, every unspoken story, every woman and man who had walked those quiet halls, wondering if anyone saw them on the day of the conference. She stood backstage, watching as hundreds of attendees filled the room, nurses, doctors, CEOs, interns, activists, people who wanted to believe in the system again. When she stepped to the podium, there was a brief hush. She took a breath and began. "I was hired at St. Jude's Hospital not long ago. I arrived full of hope, ready to give everything I had to a place I believed would honor it. Instead, I found silence where there should have been support, closed doors where there should have been opportunity, and the slow erosion of identity that comes from being seen but never acknowledged." A quiet stillness overtook the room. "I stayed anyway because someone had to, because I had a mother who taught me the cost of silence, because patients deserve more than what ego and prejudice allow." She looked out into the crowd, faces leaning forward, listening, not as strangers but as witnesses. Change Doesn't start with a sister, Maria said, her voice unwavering. It starts with one person refusing to break a long beat. Then thunderous applause. Morgan met her off stage, eye shining. You didn't speak for them, she said. You spoke with them. Maria nodded. That's how we win. When they returned to Michigan, Jude felt new, not in architecture, not in policy binders, in energy. A mural was commissioned for the main lobby, not of a single person but of many nurses, doctors, custodians, aides, all painted in vibrant brush strokes, their skin every shade of humanity. Below it a plaque read, "Diversity is our strength, inclusion is our commitment, compassion is our calling." Maria stood beneath it one morning with Sarah, one of the first nurses who had once whispered behind her back and now stood beside her with shared purpose. Feels different, Sarah said. It is, Maria replied softly, because we are in her office. That day Maria looked out the window once more, watching the morning unfold. She placed a fresh flower in the vase beside her mother's photo and reached for her calendar, filled now with meetings that mattered. She was no longer just tending to patients, she was tending to the future, one decision, one hire, one voice at a time. Jude's had not been reborn overnight, but it had been redefined, and Maria West had led it, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a leader who never stopped walking even when the halls were lined with shadows. A new chapter had begun, and it was only the first page. If you enjoyed this powerful story of resilience, justice, and transformation, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us continue bringing you stories that matter. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Maria's journey moved you the most? What did you think about how it all ended for Nurse Maria Dr. Troy Evans and Morgan Powell? Let us know in the comments how you would rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10. What lessons did you take away from this emotional journey, and where in the world are you watching from? Whether you connected most with Maria's strength, Morgan's courage to act, or the quiet reckoning that reshaped Jude's hospital, we want to hear your voice. Let's keep this conversation going.